January 17th, 1944. Marshall Islands, Central Pacific. The sky above Taroa Island burns with the amber light of late afternoon. The air tastes of salt and aviation fuel. Lieutenant Commander Jiro Tanaka sits in the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, engine idling, palms pressed against his knees in ritual stillness. Around him, 11 other fighters await the scramble order. The radio crackles. American carrier planes inbound, bearing southeast, high altitude. Tanaka closes his eyes for 3 seconds, a habit from training at Tsuchura, where instructors taught that calmness in the moment before combat was the mark of a true warrior. He has flown the Zero for 2 years. He knows its heartbeat, its temperament, the way it responds to the slightest pressure on the stick. It is an extension of his will, a blade folded 1,000 times. In his logbook, he has recorded 43 engagements, 16 confirmed kills. He has faced wildcats over the Solomons, watched them lumber and struggle in the vertical fight, their pilots sweating inside their armored cockpits as he climbed away into the sun. The Zero always climbed faster. Always. The order comes. Engines roar. 12 fighters lift off in pairs, wheels retracting, shadows stretching long across the coral runway. Tanaka pulls his fighter into a climbing turn, scanning the horizon. At 18,000 feet, he spots them. A formation of dark silhouettes, blue-gray against the clouds, moving with unhurried confidence. But these are not wildcats. The shape is wrong. The profile sharper, more compact. He radios the flight leader. New type. Unknown configuration. At that moment, 6 of the American planes break formation and dive toward the Zeros with shocking aggression. Tanaka's instinct is immediate. Climb. Pull back on the stick. Let the Zero's legendary power-to-weight ratio carry him above the threat, where he can dictate terms, choose angles, strike from advantage. The American planes should fall away below, engines straining, unable to follow. This is how every fight has gone. This is doctrine, but the Americans do not fall away. They follow. They follow upward. Tanaka's altimeter spins. 19,000 feet, 20,000, 21. His Zero is climbing at full power, nose high, airspeed bleeding, and still the blue-gray shape behind him grows larger. He can see the wings now, the broad, blunt profile, the massive cowling around an engine that sounds like rolling thunder. 22,000 feet. The American is still climbing, still closing, and now Tanaka feels something he has not felt in 2 years of combat. Something cold and unfamiliar sliding into his chest. Fear. He pushes the stick forward, rolls inverted, dives away. The American does not pursue into the dive. It does not need to. It simply climbs higher, waiting, claiming the altitude Tanaka can no longer reach. Below, 3 Zeros are already burning, spinning into the sea. The Americans have not yet fired half their ammunition. That aircraft, that blue-gray machine with the gull wings and the engine that roared like a god, was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. And in that moment above Taroa Island, the entire calculus of air combat in the Pacific began to change. For 3 years, Japanese naval aviation had flown under a singular doctrine. Lightness equals supremacy. The Zero was a masterpiece of that philosophy. An airframe stripped of unnecessary weight, an engine calibrated for efficiency, a design that sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks in exchange for range, maneuverability, and climb rate. At the outbreak of war, it was the finest carrier fighter on Earth. American pilots, who encountered it over Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines, described it in their after-action reports with a kind of horrified admiration. It turned inside the P-40. It outclimbed the F-4F Wildcat by a humiliating margin. Its 20mm cannons shredded bombers. Its range allowed it to escort strike packages across distances that seemed impossible. In the battles of 1942, Coral Sea, Midway, the grinding attrition over Guadalcanal, the Zero, remained a fearsome opponent. But cracks in its supremacy had begun to show. American pilots learned to avoid turning dogfights. They learned to use the Wildcat's ruggedness, to dive away and refuse engagement on Japanese terms, to execute slashing attacks and zoom climbs that minimized exposure. The Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver invented by Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch, turned pairs of Wildcats into mutually supporting units that could survive encounters with superior numbers of Zeros. But survival was not dominance. Even with tactics, even with courage, the Wildcat remained fundamentally outclassed in climb rate and sustained maneuverability. American carrier pilots knew they were flying an inferior machine. They won through discipline and sacrifice, and they bled for it. In the design halls of Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island, engineers understood the problem with brutal clarity. The Wildcat was tough, reliable, and easy to maintain, but it would never outfight a Zero in a fair engagement. What the Navy needed was not a better Wildcat. It needed a fighter that could beat the Zero at its own game. Climb faster, turn tighter at high speed, absorb punishment, and keep flying. And it needed to do this while carrying more guns, more ammunition, and more armor than any carrier fighter yet built. The design that emerged was the XF-6F1, which first flew in June 1942. It was powered by the Wright R2600 Cyclone engine, a solid power plant but insufficient for the performance envelope Grumman envisioned. After early testing, the decision was made to switch to the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. It was the same engine that powered the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and it transformed the Hellcat from a competent design into a war-winning weapon. The R2800 was not elegant. It was a brute, a mechanical titan that burned fuel with abandon and roared like an industrial furnace. But it delivered something the Japanese had never anticipated: the ability to combine armor, firepower, and performance in a single airframe without compromise. The Hellcat weighed nearly 4,000 pounds more than a Zero, yet it climbed faster at altitude. It carried 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds, giving it a devastating weight of fire. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. Its cockpit was armored. A Hellcat could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero outright and still bring its pilot home. But the true genius of the Hellcat lay not in any single characteristic. It lay in the totality of its design, a fighter optimized not for theoretical performance metrics, but for the practical, brutal reality of carrier warfare in the Pacific. It was easy to fly, forgiving of pilot error, stable in a dive, and predictable at the edge of a stall. Novice pilots could take it into combat and survive their first engagement. Veterans could push it to its limits and extract performance that seemed impossible from such a heavy machine. It was not a blade folded 1,000 times. It was a sledgehammer, swung with precision. The first Hellcats reached fleet squadrons in January 1943, assigned to VF-9 aboard the USS Essex. Pilots transitioning from the Wildcat marveled at the difference. Ensign Alexander Vratsiu, who would become one of the Navy's leading aces, later wrote, "The first time I climbed into a Hellcat and opened the throttle, I felt like I'd been given a gift. It was fast, it was stable, and it had power to spare. For the first time, I wasn't flying something that I had to baby along and pray would get me home. I was flying something that could win." By mid-1943, Hellcats were deployed across the Pacific Fleet, and the kill ratios began to tell a story that Japanese commanders found difficult to believe. In engagement after engagement, American pilots were not merely surviving, they were dominating. Over Marcus Island in August 1943, Hellcats from Yorktown and Essex downed 21 Japanese aircraft without a single loss. Over Tarawa in November, they shredded bomber formations with methodical efficiency. The Japanese had expected the Americans to improve their tactics. They had not expected the Americans to produce a fighter that simply outperformed the Zero in nearly every regime of flight. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with the Hellcat returned to their carriers and bases with reports that their commanders initially dismissed as exaggeration or cowardice. They described an American fighter that climbed like a Zero but hit like a freight train, that could absorb cannon fire and continue fighting, that seemed to have inexhaustible ammunition. These reports clashed with everything Japanese naval doctrine had taught. The Americans were supposed to build heavy, clumsy machines, sluggish bombers and second-rate fighters flown by men who lacked the spiritual purity and training of Japanese aviators. The idea that they could produce a fighter superior to the Zero was ideologically inconceivable. Yet the evidence accumulated. In the Gilbert Islands, Japanese air bases reported sortie after sortie where Zeros were simply overwhelmed. Not outmaneuvered, not outflown, overpowered. American pilots would bait Zeros into climbing engagements, then use their superior altitude performance to dictate the terms of combat. They would force the Zeros to burn energy in evasive maneuvers, then pounce when the Japanese fighters lost speed and altitude advantage. The Hellcat's 6 machine guns could shred a Zero's unarmored fuselage in a 2-second burst. Pilots learned to aim for the wing roots, where fuel tanks sat unprotected, and watched enemy fighters explode in mid-air. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces, encountered Hellcats over Iwo Jima in June 1944. He had survived the entire war to that point, accumulating over 60 kills, his skill and instinct legendary among his peers. In his post-war memoir, Samurai, he described the encounter with chilling clarity. I realized immediately that this was not the same type of aircraft we had faced before. It was faster in a dive, and it climbed with unbelievable power. I tried every maneuver I knew, rolls, split S, vertical scissors, and nothing worked. The American stayed with me, methodical, patient, waiting for me to make a mistake. I escaped only because another Zero drew his attention. That night, I told my squadron commander that we were fighting a machine we could not defeat. This confession, coming from a pilot of Sakai's caliber, revealed a deeper truth. The Hellcat had not merely shifted the tactical balance, it had shattered the psychological foundation upon which Japanese air doctrine rested. The Zero was more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of Japanese technical prowess, of the samurai spirit applied to modern warfare. To admit that the Americans had built something better was to admit that the entire premise of the war, the belief in inherent Japanese superiority, in the decadence and weakness of Western civilization, was a lie. And yet, the Hellcat itself was not a product of individual genius or spiritual purity. It was a product of industrial capacity, systematic engineering, and ruthless pragmatism. Grumman's factories on Long Island operated around the clock, assembling Hellcats on production lines that grew more efficient with each passing month. By the end of 1943, the company was delivering over 400 Hellcats per month. By mid-1944, that number had doubled. Workers, many of them women, many with no prior experience in aviation manufacturing, assembled wing spars, installed hydraulic systems, riveted fuselage panels with precision that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The American industrial base, which Japanese planners had dismissed as too dispersed and too distracted to sustain a long war, was producing fighters faster than Japan could train pilots to face them. The Hellcat was also a product of iterative improvement. Grumman engineers continuously refined the design based on feedback from fleet pilots. Early models suffered from carburetor icing at high altitude. The problem was fixed by redesigning the induction system. Pilots requested better visibility. The canopy was modified. The tailhook was strengthened after several landing gear failures. Armament was tested and adjusted. The Hellcat that entered service in 1943 was good. The Hellcat flying in 1945 was exceptional, incorporating hundreds of small changes that collectively transformed it into the most effective carrier fighter of the war. This process, constant feedback, rapid iteration, mass production, was fundamentally alien to Japanese military culture, which emphasized craftsmanship and individual skill over systematic improvement. Japanese factories still relied heavily on hand-fitting parts, on master craftsmen who could build an engine or assemble a wing through experience and intuition. This produced excellent aircraft, but it did not produce enough aircraft. By 1944, Japanese factories were struggling to replace losses, while American factories were producing more planes than the Navy had pilots to fly them. The recurring motif of the Hellcat, the object that came to symbolize American material supremacy, was not the aircraft itself, but the sound of its engine. Japanese pilots learned to recognize the deep guttural roar of the R-2800 at a distance. It was unmistakable, louder, rougher, more aggressive than the higher-pitched whine of the Zero's Sakai engine. That sound became a harbinger of death, a warning that the Americans were coming and that escape might not be possible. In the confined spaces of carrier-ready rooms, American pilots gave the Hellcat affectionate nicknames: the Aluminum Tank, Grumman's Iron Works, the Ace Maker. They trusted it in ways they had never trusted the Wildcat. They flew it hard, pushed it through maneuvers that would have torn apart a Zero, and it brought them home. Ensign Douglas Baker, flying off the USS Bunker Hill, wrote in a letter to his family, "The Hellcat doesn't care if you're the best pilot in the squadron or the worst. It just does what you tell it to do, and it keeps flying until you land." I've seen guys come back with holes you could put your fist through, engine smoking, half the tail gone, and the plane still flew. It's not pretty, and it's not graceful, but it wins. That pragmatism, that emphasis on function over elegance, was itself a reflection of American industrial philosophy. The Hellcat was designed to be maintained by 19-year-old mechanics working on a carrier deck in the middle of a typhoon. Panels were easily removable. Engines could be swapped in hours. Spare parts were standardized across variants. This was not the artistry of the Zero, where each aircraft was a unique creation, slightly different from the next. It was mass production weaponized, logistics transformed into lethality. By the spring of 1944, the Hellcat's dominance was undeniable. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcats from Task Force 58 destroyed more than 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The losses were catastrophic, not just in numbers, but in experience. Japan was sending newly trained pilots into combat with less than 100 hours of flight time, while American pilots had 2 or 3 times that, plus combat experience, plus a machine that forgave their mistakes. The kill ratio in that battle was more than 10-1. Many Japanese pilots never even reached the American fleet. They were intercepted at altitude by Hellcats that climbed above them and dove out of the sun. The old tactic now reversed, executed with overwhelming firepower. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission during that battle, flying a Hellcat nicknamed Mincy III. His wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, downed 6. McCampbell later described the engagement with almost clinical detachment. "They came at us in formations, straight and level, and we just positioned above them and dove. They couldn't climb to us. They couldn't run. We shot them down one after another. It wasn't heroic. It was just execution." That word, execution, carries a double meaning. It was the execution of a mission, the methodical application of superior tactics and technology. But it was also an execution in the darker sense, a slaughter, a mismatch so profound that survival became a matter of chance rather than skill. For Japanese pilots, The psychological weight of facing Hellcats became unbearable. The warrior ethos that had sustained them, the belief that spirit and skill could overcome material disadvantage, eroded with each mission. Pilots who survived began to exhibit signs of combat fatigue that Japanese military culture had no framework to address. There were no rotations, no rest periods, no acknowledgement that human beings could break under sustained pressure. Pilots flew until they died, or until their aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Lieutenant Yasuo Kuwahara, who flew Zeros in the final year of the war, later wrote about the despair that settled over his squadron. "We knew we were going to die. It was not a question of if, but when. The Americans had better planes, more fuel, more ammunition. We had spirit, and we had orders. Every morning we said goodbye to each other, and every evening fewer of us returned." The Hellcat was not just a fighter. It was a machine that proved our ideology was hollow. This realization that the material base of a society determined its military effectiveness more than the spiritual purity of its warriors was devastating. It struck at the core of what Japanese militarism had promised, that Japan's unique culture, its ancient traditions, its warrior ethos, would triumph over the decadent, materialistic West. The Hellcat, in its blunt, utilitarian efficiency, was the refutation of that promise. It was built by a society that valued innovation, mass production, and the systematic application of resources. It was flown by pilots who were trained, not indoctrinated, who saw combat as a job to be done well rather than a stage for existential heroism. American pilots, for their part, did not romanticize their work. They respected the Zero's maneuverability and the skill of veteran Japanese pilots, but by 1944, they knew they had the superior machine. They flew with confidence, not arrogance, a confidence rooted in the knowledge that their aircraft, their training, their logistics, and their doctrine were all aligned toward a single purpose: winning the war. The Hellcat's kill ratio by war's end was staggering. Of the approximately 6,000 Japanese aircraft destroyed by U.S. Navy pilots, nearly 5,000 were credited to Hellcats. It produced more aces than any other Allied fighter. It served on every American carrier in the Pacific. It flew off escort carriers, fleet carriers, light carriers. It escorted bombers, strafed ground targets, shot down kamikaze attackers, and patrolled the skies over Iwo Jima and Okinawa. It was ubiquitous, reliable, and lethal. When the war ended in August 1945, surviving Japanese pilots returned home to a nation in ruins. Many of them could not speak of what they had experienced. The shame was too profound, not personal shame, but collective shame. The shame of having believed in a vision of the world that proved catastrophically false. Some wrote memoirs decades later, and in those memoirs, the Hellcat appears again and again, not as an enemy, but as a symbol of a truth they had been forced to confront: that wars are won not by spirit alone, but by nations capable of producing, training, and deploying overwhelming material force with systematic efficiency. The Hellcat itself was phased out quickly after the war. Jet fighters were already on the horizon, and the piston engine fighter, no matter how effective, was obsolete. Thousands of Hellcats were scrapped, sold to foreign air forces, or converted to drones. A few survive in museums, their blue-gray paint faded, their engines silent. But their legacy endures in the kill ratios, in the mission reports, in the letters of pilots who flew them and lived because of them. There is a photograph taken aboard the USS Lexington in October 1944. It shows a line of Hellcats on the flight deck, engines running, pilots in their cockpits, waiting for the launch order. The carriers are steaming toward the Philippines. Behind them, the sky is heavy with clouds. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese fighters are scrambling to intercept. The Hellcats will climb through those clouds, and they will emerge into sunlight, and they will do what they were designed to do: That photograph captures something essential about the nature of industrial warfare. It is not one machine against another. It is one system against another. A system of production, logistics, training, and doctrine, all interlocking, all aligned. The Hellcat was the visible tip of that system, the sharp edge of a spear forged in factories and sharpened by experience. Japanese pilots were shocked when it outclimbed every plane they had. But the climb rate was only the symptom. The deeper shock was the realization that they were fighting not just an aircraft, but an entire civilization organized for war. A civilization that could produce such machines in quantities that seemed impossible, flown by pilots trained in methods that emphasized survival and effectiveness over suicidal heroism. In the end, the Hellcat was more than a fighter. It was a statement, delivered in aluminum and steel, in the roar of an R-2800 engine, in the 6-gun symphony of Browning machine guns. It said, "We can build more. We can build better. We can sustain this. Can you?" The answer, written in the burning wrecks of Zeros scattered across the Pacific, in the empty chairs at briefing tables, in the silence of Japanese air bases where no planes remained to fly, was no. And that, more than any single battle, more than any ace's tally, was the truth the Hellcat carried into the sky. A truth about freedom, abundance, and the cold arithmetic of industrial power. The Americans had not just built a better fighter. They had built a system capable of producing better fighters faster than their enemies could adapt. They had turned factories into weapons, logistics into strategy, and mass production into an instrument of victory. The Hellcat climbed higher, not because American pilots were braver or more skilled, though many were both. It climbed higher because behind every Hellcat was a nation that could afford to armor its pilots, that valued their lives enough to bring them home, that saw warfare not as a stage for tragic heroism, but as a problem to be solved with engineering, discipline, and overwhelming force. The Zero was beautiful, elegant, a masterpiece of minimalist design. The Hellcat was functional, brutal, and utterly pragmatic. And when those two philosophies met in the sky above the Pacific, one of them burned and the other climbed into the sun.